Alright, a miter saw is gets its name because it's designed to be good at doing miter cuts, alright, which is cutting on a 45-degree angle. Alright, so right now the saw is set for a 90-degree cut, which we'll be doing today. But I'm going to show you guys the different types of angles and cuts that it can make. Of course, we'll talk about the safety stuff, and then we'll get you guys practicing with it. And of course, we'll do our safety test. Alright, so when you guys come in, beginning of the period, you're going to find the saw locked in the down position, just like this. Alright, the way you unlock it, and I guarantee you some of you are going to come and see me because you'll forget how to do this. But underneath the motor, right here, there's a silver pin. You push down on the handle, pull the pin out, and the saw will come right up. Okay? We've got a D handle. Anybody know why they call that a D handle?
Looks like a D.
Yeah, it looks like a capital D. Okay, and we have a trigger switch, all right, to turn the saw on and off. You have to use the D handle and the trigger switch at the same time, right? It's pretty hard to not use them at the same time, all right? We have a big table, and we also have one of these things. What do we call this?
Fence.
A fence, okay? Starting to see a theme here. Table and a fence. This piece that covers the blade would be the guard, very good. And if we wanted to check the guard to see if it was working properly, we could just move the saw up and down. All right, if it moves out of the way and back and covers the blade, then it's working correctly. Okay? Now, the way we change angles. Right here, this little handle is a lock. All right, to unlock it, we lift up. And if I try to move the saw, it still will not move. All right, the reason is we have what's called a positive stop. All right, the positive stop button is right here. So if we press that down, we can then move the saw to the different angles. Okay? The reason we have a positive stop is along here we have different cutouts, little notches, at very common angles. 90 degrees, 45 degrees, 30 degrees, 22.5 degrees. Anybody know why 22.5? It seems like a random number.
Half of 45.
Very good. Half of 45 degrees. All right, sometimes you need that if your two pieces have to come together to make a 45-degree angle. They need to be cut at 22.5. So there's a red arrow that hopefully you guys can see that will point to whatever angle that you're trying to get. All right, and the positive stop will lock in, okay, at the angle. Now, is it safe to start cutting right now?
No.
Why not?
There's no wood on it. So
Well, you said there's no wood. Yeah, I'm not going to cut anything, but this was not locked, okay? You got to make sure you lock the miter saw before you go and make your cuts, all right? Don't just rely on the positive stop, all right? So just push this handle down, okay? Now, we have a safety margin at the miter saw. What do you guys think it is?
where's
5
safety
inches.
glass?
Safety margin, not safety glasses.
5 inches?
Yes, you have 5 fingers. You keep your hands 5 inches away, right? Okay. Now, on the saw, there's a line with a little symbol for where you shouldn't have your hand. That line is more than 5 inches away, okay? That's just what the saw manufacturer decided would be a good number, okay? I'm telling you, if your hand is 5 inches away or more, you're going to be fine, okay? All right, so let's say I want to cut this piece, all right? I want to make a cut, and we're going to see how long this piece is here. This one is 27.5 inches, and let's say I want to make it 26 inches, okay? Now, when we were at the radial arm saw, did I mark the front, the back, or the middle of the board? Okay, I marked the back. All right, so if I'm at 26 inches, I'm going to mark the back, put my X, and if I set it up to the miter saw, what's my problem with putting the mark in the back?
If it's in the back, like the saw doesn't touch the back at first. So.
Exactly. Okay, what he said was the saw blade doesn't touch the back of the board first. It touches the front of the board. So if that's the case, where do you guys think we should put our line? At the front. So it's different than the radial arm saw. Now, if this board was really wide, where would we put the mark? Right in the middle. Very good. Okay, so I'm going to switch that around, remark it at 26 inches. Put my X there. And I'm going to get set up to cut. I'm going to hold my hand so I'm on top of the board, just like with the radial arm. Okay? Hold it down on the table, up against the fence, nice and tight. I'm going to bring the D handle down, and I'm going to line it up. Okay? Do you think it would be better to cut the board a little too big or a little too small?
A little too big.
Definitely a little too big. So I'm going to overcut it a little bit. And I can always go back and make it smaller. All right? Do you think I should ever start the saw while it's touching the wood?
No.
No, you always want to start it in the air. We're going to make our cut, and then once the cut's finished, I'm going to turn the saw off, let it totally stop. I'm going to wait till the blade stops, and then I'll lift it back up. All right? If we lift it up while the saw is still spinning, the little block of wood could get kicked up in the air. All right? Okay, so I'm going to keep my hand at least 5 inches away. I'm going to start it, and we're going to make our cut. I'm going to line it up. Okay.
Mr. Friedman?
Yes, sir.
Is this machine attached to the sawdust collector?
Yes, it is. We're going to run that. Very good question. Okay, so you guys can see I made my cut a little bit oversized than what it should be, but I can go back and clean that up. Okay? All right, so we've been saying about down against the table, up against the fence. What do you think would happen if I held the board out here away from the fence and made my cut? Yes. Okay, he said it'll shoot the board towards the fence. The blade's spinning in this direction, so as soon as it hits, all right, it's going to slam it against the fence, probably with 10 times that intensity and scariness, and the board may blow apart into many pieces. Okay, so it's very important we always keep it against the fence. All right. Do you ever think it would be a good idea, Noor, to cross your arms while you're using the saw? No, just like on the radial arm, you never ever cross your arms. You guys can see how that could be a problem, right? Okay. Now, would it be okay if I switched hands and used the saw this way?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, as long as you don't cross your arms, you can work on either side. Does that make sense? Okay. I want to show you guys some angled cuts. So we're going to go to very common angle, 45 degrees for a miter cut. It's the same thing. We're going to hold the board in place, make our cut, and then we'll see what we can do with that. All right, here we go. Okay. So with a 45-degree cut like this, when we bring the boards together, have you guys seen a joint like that before?
Yeah.
Where might you see something like that?
Door.
Okay,
Picture
door
frame.
frame, picture frame. Where else?
A door.
Possibly a table.
A door.
Okay, a door. Possibly some trim around a window, something like that. Okay, very, very handy joint to know how to make. Now, you guys will be doing miter joints a lot this year when you build your tiny furniture. Okay. The tricky thing is your molding for the tiny piece of furniture is going to be a very thin strip of wood. So, first of all, do you think it would be better to go faster or slower for that thin piece? Very, very slow. Because what happens is, this board is pretty rigid, right? Because it's big. When you get a thin strip of wood, it starts to get a little more flexible. So what happens is you need to hold it a little bit close and really, really tight. Because as soon as that blade hits that little piece of wood, it wants to lift it off the table. All right, we'll talk about that a little more as you guys get closer to that stage. But while we're on the subject, do you think it's safer to hold our hand 5 inches away or to keep our hand at the very end of the board really far away? Definitely 5 inches. Because check it out. If I hold it at the end and I think I'm being safe this way, the blade can easily lift this off the table. All right, if my hand is close, there's no way that can come off the table. All right, does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. This is called a compound miter saw. All right, and what that means is not only can it angle left and right, but we can tilt the blade different angles. So we're going to do that. We're going to do a compound cut. I'm going to bring this back to, like, I don't know, different angle. Just try it. We're going to unlock this, tilt the saw a little bit that way. All right, and this is completely random. I just want to show you guys the different types of cuts. Okay, and it's the same process. We're holding it down against the table, up on the fence, and we're going to make this cut. Okay. So now we can get to doing crazy stuff like this, all right? You guys probably won't have to do compound angles much, but you might, depending on what you build this year. All right, so it's good to know that this saw can do stuff like that, all right? Now, typically, my students, for whatever reason, are terrified of the miter saw. And really, there's no reason to be. I think it just sounds super scary because it sounds really gnarly. You know, this saw here was made in China. It's made of plastic and aluminum parts. All right, so it's not a well-built machine compared to like the radial arm saw where it's all cast iron. Okay, so this sounds a lot worse than it really is. Basically, if your hands are where they're supposed to be and you're doing everything correctly, it's not going to hurt you. Okay, yes, sir.
Does this have the laser line?
No. What he's talking about is some saws now have a little laser that'll put a line down so you don't have to line up the blade every time, but we're not fancy like that. So we don't have that. Okay. Questions so far about the miter saw? All right. The other reason I think my students were terrified of this machine is because it's a sliding miter saw, meaning not only does it go up and down, but the saw blade can slide out. I've disabled that sliding feature because what would happen is from the saw moving in all different directions, we would get kickbacks. All right, the blade would get pinched and the saw would raise up very quickly and kind of in a scary way. All right, the reason a kickback happens usually on a miter saw is if you don't have a nice jointed edge, right? Remember we talked about this machine, you have to have a jointed edge, whereas the radial arm saw, you don't necessarily need a jointed edge. Here's the reason for that. All right, if we have a board like this, the edge is not jointed, right? And we hold it up on the fence, and there's some gaps between the board and the fence, right? We said on the radial arm saw, it cuts from where to where? Back to front. The miter saw cuts from where to where? Front to back. So imagine there's a gap in the back here by the fence. We're pushing against the fence. The saw starts to cut the front of the board. So while we're pushing against the fence, that little gap that the saw blade makes, called the saw kerf, does that get bigger or smaller? It's smaller. Okay, so now that wood starts squeezing the blade, and the blade doesn't like to be squeezed. So as soon as the blade gets pinched like that, the board will kick back, the saw will come flying up. Quite scary. The radial arm saw, however, we're cutting from the back to the front. As you're holding on, does that saw kerf get bigger or smaller? Bigger. So that's the difference. All right, it's just a design feature. So when we're cutting on the miter saw, we have to have what type of edge? Jointed edge. Very good. Okay. All right, so we're going to set this back to 90 degrees. We're going to have you guys take some turns making cuts.
I didn't see how you turned it on.
Okay, the trigger switch, right on the D handle. Good question. All right. Are we good to go?
Yes.
Why not?
It's not locked in.
All right, I forgot to lock it. Very good. So make sure it's always locked. Okay. Any questions before we get started? All right, some of you that have like anything dangling, anything loose, needs to either take it off or tuck it in or whatever, okay? I would take that off, absolutely. All right, so if we could, we're going to start the dust collector, form a line, and we'll all take turns. We're going to cut about 3/4 of an inch off of each piece. All right, guys? Ready? Again, great job, just like you've been doing as far as your first cut and everything. My only suggestion for some of you, just make sure that blade stops completely before you raise the saw back up, okay? All right. Do you think it would be a good idea if we had a board that had a twist in it
No.
to cut it? No. All right, there's other ways to get around working with a piece like that. Sometimes with the radial arm saw, we may be able to get away with cutting a piece like that. The miter saw, different story, okay? All right, so let's just do a little bit of a review, okay? If we wanted to check the guard to make sure it's working properly, how would we do that?
You just turn it down, but you don't turn it off.
Okay, just move it up and down. If the guard moves away and covers the blade, then we're good to go. Is it a good idea to talk with your friends while you're working on the miter saw?
No.
No. All right. What are the two parts that you use at the same time called? D-handle and trigger switch. Very good. Do we make any adjustments while the saw is running?
No.
No. It'd be kind of hard to do that anyway, right?
Yeah.
All right. What would happen if the board was not held against the fence?
Shoot towards the fence.
Right. So you got to make sure we always hold it against the fence, down on the table. Is it ever a good idea to start the saw while it's touching the piece of wood?
No.
No. All right. Why do we never cross our arms or hands?
Saw it off.
Yes, you don't want to cut yourself. Very good. What's the safety margin?
5 inches.
5 inches. Very good. And what do we have to wear?
Safety goggles.
Excellent. All right, guys, you can take a seat, and we'll get our tests out.
I wasn't